Welcome to the Retaining WIT podcast. I'm Josie Haynes.
And I'm Jordana Kwok.
This show tackles the challenges of keeping women in tech.
Each episode, we discuss current events, experiences in the industry, and what it takes to create a workplace where women will thrive. Today on Retaining WIT, we are thrilled to have Kathryn Vandiver, who is currently VP of Engineering at BlueOwl and has over 3 decades of technical experience in Silicon Valley, which includes roles at VMware, HP, and NetApp. Thank you, Kathryn, for joining us today.
Thanks, Jordana, for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
Hey, it's Josie here. It's great to see you again and catch up with you after a little bit. I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about yourself and your journey so far in Silicon Valley.
Thanks. Well, I'm kind of a native here in Silicon Valley, just having grown up with technology all around me. My father was an engineer, and I just had a lot of interest in STEM growing up. When it came time to figure out what I wanted to do in college, I always had an interest in engineering. It just seemed like a real natural fit for me. And so I studied engineering, and when I graduated, went to work at HP. After working at HP for a couple of years and working on developing and designing a bunch of subsystems for HPUX, I was real interested in learning more about how products were built and the features and how product decisions were made, and became real interested in the business side of the house, and along the way moved into more tech lead roles and then eventually into management. So that was a bit of the start of my journey. Since then, I've moved on to a couple of different companies that you mentioned, Jordana, and have really just enjoyed the ride along the way.
Thanks so much for taking the time to share. What's actually interesting in the whole small valley world is we actually both worked at NetApp and Sun, I believe, during our careers.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. We think of the valley as just huge in a sense of the number of engineers, but there are these pockets of people where you just run into them just based on interest and skill set. And I think it's great, Josie, that you and I have so much to share in that regard.
Speaking of pockets and communities of people in the Valley, something that I've seen is gender segregation based on domain of expertise. Is this something you've seen, and do you believe it has gotten better or worse over the years?
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, Jordana, and that's something that I've really noticed. I think there's a lot of challenges along the way, not only just being the only woman in the room, but I think also just trying to stay in our field. I would say the biggest challenge I've faced in staying in the field is being true to myself on what I want to do and being part of development and delivering products and features. I've also observed that we tend to get segregated into different roles depending upon our skills. So, for example, if somebody's really good at scheduling, or somebody's really good at negotiating schedules, or somebody's really good at helping others figure out how to break down a big project into small chunks, we automatically get segregated into maybe being a release manager, which would then get segregated even further into being a role that's even further outside of actually writing development or writing code, which is kind of what some of us go into this field to do. That's just one example. As I mentioned earlier, for myself, when I was growing in my career, I became interested in how the business decisions were being made and the features that we were building. Early in my career, I was asked to join a technical marketing team because I found just going and visiting customers really fun and learning how they were using the product. Well, my interest in learning how customers were using the product is so I could actually build and design and code a better experience for them. The way the product team looked at it was, hey, this is great. We have somebody who's interested in product roadmaps. Would you be interested in moving into the product space? And it was a fork in the road, and I chose to stay in development. But those types of things happen often in our careers. I mean, nothing's linear, but those are the areas where I think we as women begin to become segregated into some of those roles that are really not the ones that we set out at the beginning of our careers.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing about that. Actually, what was really interesting is the Illyria newsletter this week was actually about a recent article in Bloomberg that shared findings of a research study which concluded that women are actually less interested in being leaders. And yes, this article didn't sit well with the Illyria team. It didn't sit well with me when I read it, because they didn't really look into the discrimination that potentially is playing. Is it hard being the only one in the room? Is it men are promoting other men? The lack of interest may literally be due because of being pigeonholed. And so having studies like this, especially in something like Bloomberg coming out saying that women aren't interested in leadership, just really ties into this topic, I feel.
I'm blown away at that, just because the women I know and the people around me are leaders in their own right. I mean, look, we're we are leading on so many levels, even if it's not at work. We lead our personal lives, we're leading families, we're leading, we have leadership opportunities all around us in what we do every single day. And to think that a woman would not want to be in leadership just blows my mind. I would say that for me, it's really interesting. I've been frustrated at lack of leadership, which has pushed me into leadership at different times in different companies and different projects. And often the case is, a decision that is, there's a vacuum. Nobody's made a decision. So pushing myself to be the person to step up and make a decision, rallying troops to say, hey, look, we got to deliver this thing. Let's get together and figure out how we're going to do it. Being the one who's in the room with the pen in hand on the whiteboard, trying to figure out how to get us from A to B to C to D on a project. I think women are definitively ready for this, for leadership. I think that it would be, and they want to be in leadership roles. I don't think that women are shying away from it at all. I've never really seen that ever.
I'm seeing the opposite, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, where actually a lot of women don't stay on the technical individual contributor track and want to move into people management really early. And it speaks to wanting to be in a leadership position to be able to make decisions and so on. But I do think that it's interesting, especially in tech, because it's a tricky spot to be in when you only have like 2 to 3 years of individual contributor, like hands-on engineering experience, and then you move into that people management role. What I often see is people who make that transition tend to get stuck in the frontline management role and can't really grow strategically because of that lack of experience. So how do you stay technical as a manager?
I think that's something that we have to we owe it to our teams to stay technical. That's the way I look at it. I think there's a part of leadership where your team needs you to have a certain level of technical depth. They're the ones with the hands on the keyboard sooner or later, and they're writing the code. So they have the details of maybe the details of the code. What we need to do is ask questions on architecture, decisions, how decisions are made. How do we take an architecture from good to even better? How do we take a product from good to even better? And what might be blocking a feature success or a schedule success. So we have to ask ourselves and we have to ask our teams those questions in order to challenge them to do better. So, but as far as our technical, I think it's incumbent on us to know what's happening in the industry, to ask questions about trends, to look for trends, do research. I mean, I still read technical articles on a regular basis to find out what trends are, because I owe it to my team to keep current enough so I can have better foresight into what they're doing and some of the challenges that they're facing.
Thank you for sharing those insights. And I agree with what we were talking about. I see so many times women in some ways getting encouraged to go into these management roles. But if you don't have enough of the technical, just experiences, it's not even a specific experience. It's literally having the combined years of seeing, oh, this is what happens when you do this and that. It is much harder to go up that management ladder if you haven't seen it. So I encourage folks, like, if you want to be a manager, that's amazing. Like, let's work on that, but also figure out how technical you want to be first before somebody forces you into that position potentially. So yeah, thank you about sharing that. And if our listeners do happen to be in a lower paid role and want to get out of this pigeonhole, what are some recommendations you might have for them?
I think that, well, first and foremost, I think you should find out where you're lacking. I mean, a lot of women are really shy about asking what they need to do to improve. Where do they need to deliver differently or change differently to make an impact. For example, you might go to your manager and really ask, what is it that I need to do to make a bigger impact so I'm recognized for my contribution in order to get to that next level or to get to that next salary range or increase in salary? We need to be first and foremost comfortable in doing that. And I think a lot of women are not comfortable doing that. We need to teach them that it's okay to ask those bold questions, because I think that, to me, where I see women is that we're not confident enough to ask those questions. We all struggle a little bit with imposter syndrome in the beginning anyway, but how do we really look at creating a support group around us so we can be comfortable in asking those questions? Also, I think letting your manager or the people around you, or finding a champion or finding a sponsor, letting them know what it is that you're passionate about and going after that passion, not allowing yourself to be segregated into a role that's something you're not interested in, following your vision for yourself of where you want to go, whether you want to be in a leadership role, whether you want to be in a management role, whether you want to stay technical and just go deeper as a deep subject matter expert in your role. I think there's a lot of things that we can do to help ourselves in some of those areas, but they're not easy, because again, we're struggling with so much identity in the first place in this space, because it doesn't make it easy in this industry. It's a tough industry, I'll tell you that much.
Yeah, you touched on a couple of things I think are crucial, right? And I definitely want to reinforce, which is the confidence thing. I think as women, we have a lot less confidence overall in general than men. Like, I have seen men show up to my office and ask for things, and I'm like, well, that takes some courage. And then I'll have a woman be like, oh, I can't ask for that, when it's like the exact same thing her peers are asking for, right? And so this is why I tell folks, hey, network not just with other women, but also go network with your male peers as well. Start understanding like where they're making their money. And then ultimately, I think the other thing about being pigeonholed is sometimes I think we feel like once we've gone in one direction, like we have to stay in that direction. And I think one of the big things I share with people is my career was not linear. I went back from being an IC to a manager multiple times in my career before I truly decided leadership was my jam. And so for anybody listening in who wants to test it out, there's nothing wrong with saying, no, I want to stay technical instead.
Yeah, that's very similar to my story. I've gone back and forth between being an individual contributor and also a people manager. And each time I brought something different to the table. And that experience is really valuable. And going back to being an individual contributor doesn't mean you get a pay cut. In fact, probably can even make more the more technically specialized you are. And I think there's this, perhaps in the industry, a little bit of this assumption that, oh, if I go into people management, this gets me out of that low-paying role. It's not necessarily the case. If you do find good roles at companies that value the engineering expertise, you can actually go a long way with making a lot more money as an individual contributor. So I think knowing that, you kind of have to have that network, and you kind of have to go out to interview to see what the industry is paying for those roles.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, that's what the dual ladder is all about. And I think there's a lot about the dual ladder that can really put you in a leadership role without having people responsibility. People responsibility, I kind of feed into the concept of the leadership pipeline, which is when you're an individual contributor, you're looking at your own contribution, the contribution of your schedule, your accountability. And when you move up into management, now you're responsible for your team. You're responsible for understanding the roadblocks that they're facing. You're responsible for eliminating those roadblocks before they're hit. You're looking at your team. Does the team have the composition and the skill set? And does the team have what they need to be successful? But the dual track and the dual leadership track, I think, is really great, because you can become a subject matter expert, have influence on business, have influence on how corporate decisions are made, if depending upon where you are on that dual track, and to be an influencer and leader in a different way where you don't have the management responsibility. And so I think there's a huge amount of opportunity there. And I've worked with technical directors, I've worked with principal engineers who are really high up and that have fairly significant influence on all the way up to the CEO level or the CTO level, depending upon the size of the company, where they're leaders in their own right and subject matter experts. So you're right, Jordana, there is that nice dual ladder. And that's another opportunity for people to, and for women in particular, to look and learn what that dual ladder looks like and how they can grow into being a leader in that regard as well.
To go off a bit on a tangent, what do you think of using technical complexity as a way to segregate roles and pay? For example, I often hear that backend engineers should get more pay because the work is more complex than, say, front-end work. And this actually massively undervalues the complexity, on the front-end side with ambiguity, uncertainty. That's part of how humans behave with UI and machines. And it seems like the industry has kind of built a system that doesn't necessarily incentivize the things that bring the most value. So I'm curious if you've noticed this.
I find it frustrating and think that it's a way to solve the recruiting problem. If there are fewer specialists in a certain area, then recruitment will tell us that the pipeline is hard and it's more complex, and therefore we need to give more incentive or more money to candidates who have that specialty. But it tends to shift. So we see specialty shift from back end to front end to other functional areas. It tends to, in what I've seen, is it tends to shift depending upon the technology and some of the evolution that's happening in different areas. We talked earlier about design systems, for example. There's a specialty in design systems that may not have been there a couple of years ago. So we see things shift back and forth. I think that there are unbelievably tough problems at all levels of software, not just one area or another. And I think complexity is at all levels. I don't see it in any one level that's more simple than another level. And I really do believe that we tend to use the recruitment effort and the recruitment problem as a way to explain it away. I think there's new ideas all across, new architectures, new ways of solving problems that occur at all levels. And no single segment has expertise or has cornered the market on any of this. Today, we want our solutions to be more intuitive across the stack. And companies are on a journey of evolving and how to get there, regardless of the level.
I think this is a really fascinating topic, and it can really verge into even more areas, because if you really think about it, we really should be truly valuing the value somebody is providing. However, like I said, this could be a whole other topic. What about geography? Where does that come into play? And is that potentially another form of discrimination if we ultimately are thinking about it? And there's a whole pros and cons on geography-based pay versus not. And so I think there's a lot of things to think about. And I think this really reinforces the fact that as leaders and hiring managers, it's on us to slow down our thinking when we're considering these sorts of topics, because there might not be a right answer. It really is figuring out what works for your company. And so we talked about the fact that there can be some discrimination potentially at play here. And so what can today's leaders be doing more to prevent this?
Well, I think when we talk about gender segregation, we spend a lot of time encouraging women and girls to go into STEM. We have girls who code. We spend a lot of time trying to understand what happens to middle school girls around STEM, potentially turning away from STEM. We try to encourage our high school girls to go into STEM. And then even in college, what we can do as leaders once we're in the industry is make sure that we're encouraging women to stay in these roles, to retain them in these roles, to work with them, to coach them, to help them find a champion, perhaps be their champion or their sponsor, and take it upon ourselves to understand what they're doing in their role, that they're bringing value every day. Because the percentage of women is so small, I think it's incumbent on me to find out what are the women in my team doing, how are they contributing, and go above and beyond just a name on a list somewhere, but really learning what are the, learning about them, helping understand where their barriers are, and also making sure that when it does come time to things like projects or focals or merit raises, that we're being equitable across the company. I think that's a very important thing as well. Those metrics will matter. We also can help each other out, just being better sponsors to each other and communities and peers. I think there's a lot of communities out there for professional women. They don't cost anything to join, but you just get a wonderful wealth of support from others in the community. And if you can find an informal sponsor or informal mentor, then take full advantage of that and network into that space if you need to. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to do that as well. And now, today, the barriers of geography have been somewhat removed because we're all working from home. So you don't have to be meeting in a coffee house. You could just meet on Zoom and get to know each other and get to support each other that way as well.
Yeah, and that certainly opens the door to an even larger network. So that's what I've really appreciated from the diversity community in particular. Thank you so much for sharing that. And we like to end each episode with a Retaining WIT tip of the week. Is there any advice you'd like to share with our listeners?
A little bit of advice that I received a couple years ago is, I would say it's probably a couple things. One is building a little bit of resilience and grit. Think of with every challenge in our lives, we are slowly building this layer of resiliency on ourselves. And I had a manager years ago tell me to think of it like Teflon. She said, you slowly build Teflon up on yourself. And she said, and when... I might have to restate this for your podcast, but when the shit hits, it rolls right off. And the thicker the Teflon gets, the easier it is for it to roll off. And it's really important to build resilience and grit in this field. I think you can't get this far. You can't get very far if you don't have it. And it just really, don't take things personally. Understand it's just work. It's not life. Life is so different than work, and just work to kind of build up that level of resiliency as best as you can.
Love that tip. It's one of the things I talk to women about when it comes to how to stay in tech. So I think it's so crucial. Well, this is another great episode of Retaining WIT. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed the talk.
Thank you so much, Kathryn.
All right. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening to the Retaining WIT podcast. You can keep up with our latest episodes at retainingwit.com, on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast shows.